Okay, let us get started. Welcome to the webinar, Better Together, How Collective Impact 3.0 Helps Communities Collaborate for Greater Student Success. Let me get our slides set up here. I am your host, Kathy McDonald, Assistant Director for Network Partnerships for the Florida College Access Network. A little bit of housekeeping here. You'll see a question box in your dashboard if you're viewing our webinar from your desktop, so feel free to submit your questions at any time. This is all about learning together, so please submit your questions and we will take those probably at the end, but we might intersperse them throughout as well. Please also share what you're learning on social media. You will also see in your dashboard in the handout section, there are several handouts you will find helpful with today's topic, including the webinar slides. If you are viewing from a mobile device and don't see the handouts, don't worry, we're going to be recording this, sending out the recordings and the handouts after the session, so you'll get those later. So don't feel like you have to feverishly take notes through our presentation. A bit about FCAN, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we create and strengthen a statewide network of cross-sector collaborations that seek to help more students succeed to be college and career ready. We do our work in three primary ways: through our local college access networks, which you'll hear a little bit more about that today. That's some of the work we're going to be talking about. We also do this work through our research, data, and policy work. We act as a clearinghouse for some of the best sources for education-related data and research. And finally, through our statewide initiatives where we help mainly high schools, but also K through 12 throughout the state, help their students prepare for college and beyond. Today, I am thrilled to welcome on our call guest presenter Liz Weaver, who's the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, where she's leading the Tamarack Learning Center, focused on advancing community change efforts. Liz is well known for her thought leadership on collective impact and is the author of several popular and academic papers on the topic. She is a co-catalyst partner with the Collective Impact Forum and leads a collective impact capacity building strategy with the Ontario Trillium Foundation. Liz is passionate about the potential of communities getting to impact on complex issues. Prior to her current role at Tamarack, Liz led the Vibrant Communities Canada team, supporting communities in developing their frameworks of change and guiding their projects from idea to impact. From 2006 and 2009, Liz was the director for the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction, which was recognized with the Canadian Urban Institute's David Crombie Leadership Award. In 2002, Liz completed a master's in management at McGill University. Liz has been awarded the Queen's Jubilee Medals in 2002 and 2012 for her contributions to volunteerism in Canada, and in 2004 was awarded the Women in the Workplace Award from the City of Hamilton. On to our second presenter, Lisa Church, where I'm thrilled to welcome Lisa as well. She's the Vice President of Champions for Learning at the Education Foundation of the Collier County in Florida. She's currently leading the Future Ready Collier on behalf of Champions for Learning, which is the backbone organization facilitating this collective impact initiative. Future Ready Collier is a network of more than 60 organizations working to ensure every child in Collier County is both kindergarten ready and has a plan for once they graduate high school. Lisa brings extensive experience in public education, corporate and nonprofit environments to her collective impact work. She's earned her Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Notre Dame in American Studies and Anthropology, and her Master's of Arts from Indiana University at Bloomington in Latin American Studies. She is also a 2014 Leadership Collier graduate. To get us started today, we want to hear a little bit about what you are facing in terms of cross-sector collaboration. So let's launch a poll and get your input on what you see are the biggest challenges that you face in cross-sector collaboration. So go ahead and vote now. Is it organizational silos, power dynamics, lack of trust, sharing data, community engagement? Okay, votes are coming in here. We're seeing a little bit of everything so far. Interestingly, lack of trust is not as high as some of the others. Give it another couple of seconds. Okay. All right, we are going to close that out. Let's share the results of that. So as you'll see, 54% are seeing organizational silos and 46% community engagement. So bringing in some of those community partners and voices to the table. So great. Thanks for sharing your input there. That's really helpful. And that'll help Lisa and Liz know where to focus some of their comments later. Okay, so let's get us started here. To set the stage for today's topic, communities are learning that schools and colleges alone cannot remove every barrier that students face to success on their journey to earn a credential so that they can be prepared for tomorrow's jobs and move up economically. What we're seeing is that partners across sectors collaborating together is the emerging model for student success, where organizations provide their strengths to the table so that education leaders can focus on what they do best. And that way, our students get their holistic needs met. Back in 2011, the Stanford Social Innovation Review published an article that was produced by John Cania and Mark Kramer from FSG entitled Collective Impact. And that article sought to articulate a framework for large-scale social change. Since that time, community change experts have highlighted more examples and elements of what it takes to drive population change around complex problems like poverty, homelessness, and education. The Tamarack Institute is internationally recognized as a leader in large-scale change. As part of their Community Change series in 2016, they set out to articulate the next evolution, Collective Impact 3.0, an evolving framework for community change. You will find this white paper in the handout section of your dashboard, and I invite Liz now to share a little bit about how that evolved. Part of what I particularly appreciate about this evolving framework is bringing in more of that community voice, which many of you in the poll just shared is a challenge as we seek to have the biggest impact in our community. So with that, let me turn it over to Liz. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks, Kathy, and so nice to be joining everybody today. I bet that most of you are in Florida or in the larger Florida area, which is much warmer than we have here in Canada right now. We're starting to go into the fall, so thanks so much. So maybe, Kathy, we can advance the slide. This is me. I'm the co-CEO, and you've heard my bio a little bit. So Kathy just introduced that my colleague and I, Mark Cabage, wrote a paper about almost 2 years ago now about Collective Impact 3.0. And one of the big ideas behind this paper was, Tamarack had been working in this field. We've been a co-collaborator with the folks at FSG and the Collective Impact Forum and a number of other organizations in the United States. And we were observing some things in Canada and the Canadian context that was really helping to advance the collective impact work. And our work also often takes us to the US and internationally, and we observe this in those communities as well. Either these conditions for Collective Impact 3.0 either existed or they were not there. And so we thought, well, what if we write a paper and really try to advance our kind of collective thinking about how this field can be more intentional in their work. So let's go to the next slide. So this slide really is the context setter for this paper. So, what we saw was kind of, and we framed it in 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 as the evolution in terms of this revolution of really trying to impact large-scale community-wide change, which is, I think, where collective impact is best suited. So the 1.0 that we saw was really that people across communities were working collaboratively together. And this was framed in a whole bunch of different ways. The Aspen Roundtable on Community Solutions was working in this area largely with a focus on neighborhood change. At Tamarack, we had a network of communities across Canada that were working on place-based poverty reduction. And so while this work was all happening, there wasn't really a framework, a defined framework. It was much more spontaneous and much more kind of developmental. And then the article appeared in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, the article by John Kania and Mark Kramer. And that was in 2011. And, you know, for us at Tamarack, it was kind of like, oh, you know, we were singing because what we saw in that article was reflecting the work that we were doing on the ground in these 13 cities across Canada trying to move the needle on poverty reduction. And I'm sure that, you know, there are many other groups in Canada, the US, and in other places that when they read about collective impact, they said, while we might not have all the conditions in place, we certainly do have many of those conditions. And then since 2011, what we've seen is really this 5 years of experimentation, this practice. We've really seen the practice of collective impact evolve. And that then led us to thinking about, okay, so as it's evolving, how could we even speed it up quicker? Because there are some real challenges when we're trying to work at whole systems change or whole scale community change. And so what were some of the lessons that we had learned? And that really is the evolution to the 3.0. And that's what I'll talk about today. But that just sets it in context for you. Next slide. So we all know that the framework, and I'm just going to review it really quickly, the framework for collective impact is really based on 8 things, 3 preconditions, and then 5 conditions. And the preconditions are influential champions. At Tamarack, we think influential champions, yes, but how do we intentionally bring in the spheres of influence, right? How do we, if you get the president of the college, for example, how do you bring the whole college system into the work of change that you're trying to do? So that's how we kind of spin in influential champions. Urgency of the issue, I think, is a really critical precondition for collective impact, because it really is, you know, how urgent or important does your community perceive the issue of cradle to career educational outcomes to be, high school graduation rates? Is it something that is even on their radar screen? And so this precondition you have to pay attention to in communities, and if you want to scale community change, and then adequate resources. And in our opinion, it's, you know, what are the human and financial resources that are truly required to get to deep and durable change? And then if we go to the next slide, it really tells us about the 5 conditions of collective impact. So next slide. So the 5 conditions are that of a common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and backbone. So, you know, these are really at the root of what a collective impact initiative should look like. A common agenda. You know, they once asked the director, Francis Ford Coppola, the difference between a good movie and a bad movie. And he said that a good movie is when everybody makes the same movie. And, you know, if you think about that, that's really what we're trying to do with a common agenda. We're getting everybody in the community to make the same movie, whether it's around, you know, mental health issues, it's around poverty and homelessness, or it's around educational outcomes, that the community is buying in. Shared measurement, as we all know, is not only that data that we know that really gives us the case for urgency of the issue, but then intentionally measuring our results as we go. Mutually reinforcing activities, I think, is the sweet spot of collective impact. It's saying that we have a ton of really good stuff happening in our community. It's just all happening kind of in an uncoordinated way. And mutually reinforcing activities is the bringing together of that work in an intentional kind of way and getting the boats to all row relatively in the same direction. And then continuous communication and backbone is really the how of collective impact. It's how do we how do we support the getting of to the common agenda, the shared measurement, etc. So that's the framework. The 3 preconditions and the 5 conditions are the core of the framework. So as we begin to think about collective impact 3.0, we'll move on to the next slide. We looked at the basis of this framework and we said, okay, so what could we do to really inform the framework and get to 3.0? And so if you see this, the first column is really 1.0, right? We saw people working on specialized agendas and fragmented approaches, independent activities, etc. And then we got to collective impact 2.0, which is the middle column where we identified common agenda, or the folks at FSG actually identified common agenda, shared measurement, mutually reinforcing activities, etc. But largely when Mark and I began to look at how collective impact was evolving, what we saw was that most communities were taking a management approach to the problem, and these were complex problems. So if you think about homelessness, or you think about educational outcomes or poverty, they are very complex. Each experience of that problem is unique. And so, you've really got to think about, okay, so what's the complexity? How is this complexity unfolding in our community? And what are the levers that we have in our community to really start to move the needle on something that is a vexing or complex problem to us? And so we started to think about that. And we said, well, what if we didn't manage the problem? What if we built a movement around the problem? And so that's the biggest idea in Collective Impact 3.0, is this notion of movement building. How do we, as Rich Harwood from the Harwood Institute talks about, how do we not only turn inward to our planning tables, but then turn outward to our communities and authentically engage our communities in this work and really try to, utilize their energy, their expertise, their perspectives in building this movement. And then as we started to look at each of the conditions, we said, common agenda, yes, but what if we made it aspirational as opposed to tackling poverty? What we did in Hamilton, the work I did in Hamilton was, yes, we're working on poverty and particularly child and family poverty. What if we framed it as making Hamilton the best place to raise a child? Would that bring in some new people into the conversation who might not necessarily be in the conversation about poverty, but everybody can be in the conversation about it being the best place to raise a child? And so it's, how do we create these aspirations? Shared measurement, yes, but it's one thing to measure, but then it's really much more important to look at how we're measuring things and what are we learning. What are the things that are impacting our learning around this? Mutually reinforcing activities, yes, but there's leverage points. And how do we focus on leverage points? Continuous communication, yes, but also how do we engage authentically to build this movement? And then backbone, yes, and also how do we think about it as a container? And I'm going to spend a couple minutes on each of these. So if we go to the next slide. This next slide is really this idea of moving from a management paradigm to movement building. And to some degree, we have to do both, right? We have to think about, what are the elements of the problem that have more of a technical component to them that we can solve if we just start to bring people together, and we can actually make some of those management decisions or decisions around resource flows, etc. But then movement building is really this notion of bringing together this broad and quite diverse group of leaders, and not always just those in the traditional seats of power. It's really thinking about, if there's, students who are really successful at, graduating high school and moving into the college experience, we want to learn from them. But equally, we want to learn from those kids who don't feel like they fit into the college experience, and why aren't they attracted? So we want to figure out both pathways and to come up with the solutions that meet the needs of both, right? We also want people, as they begin to think about these more complex issues, to bring their hearts to this work, right? And so we really at Tamarack think about this as head, heart, and hand work. And we often ask the question, particularly around collective impact tables, and you can do this if you're supporting a collective impact table in your work. Why is it important that I'm here? And that is not just a head question, it's also a heart question, right? Why is it important that I'm here today? Why is it important that I'm at this table? And we found, in the work in Hamilton around poverty reduction, when we asked that question, we were really surprised by some of the answers from traditional leaders around the table, and also some of the non-traditional folks that were around our table. So you don't know people's life experiences. And so when you ask them why it's important, they often bring in their personal connection to the issue. And so that, I think that's very critical to make it successful, because when people are engaged at the heart level, they are really engaged, right? And it is about that kind of deeper connection, not just the theoretical connection. And then we know that it's about transforming systems, right? So collective impact is a strategy that is, we can learn a lot about what's going on, when people are bumping up against things and they're not breaking through. Collective impact is saying, okay, so we see this pattern of lots of people bumping up against this barrier. How do we break through that barrier? And how do we use our collective wisdom and our collective resources to do that? So those are the big ideas behind movement building. If we go to the next slide, Kathy. So this continuous communication kind of to authentic engagement really builds on movement building, this notion of movement building, really. And this is about putting community at the center and really saying, we benefit. We would say this in Hamilton a lot, because Hamilton is a city of about 500,000 people, and we have 40 people sitting around the round table when we started this work. So 40 people will never solve poverty, but if you actually begin to put the community at the center and bring in the wisdom of, folks who are navigating poverty, but also folks that are, that have good, deep knowledge about the community, then in fact, the community begins to own it. And we're really trying to build in this ownership of this problem. And if you build in the ownership, then people are much more committed to the solution. It's also about getting 360 insight around the problem. And it's about, thinking about all voices and the fact that all voices matter and that all voices have an impact. And it really allows us to then employ much more of an equity lens to this work, by bringing those voices in. And so that's really about authentic engagement. It's about the turning outward, right? And really saying, okay, so whatever issue we're working on, who are the people that really need to be around the table to resolve this issue? Who are the people from a systems perspective, from a leadership perspective, from a community perspective? They bring that expertise to the table. And I think that that's really where we're trying to go with the notion of authentic engagement. Next slide, Kathy. The community aspiration, here's Francis Ford Coppola again. The community aspiration for us is really about trying to build on authentic engagement, but really in the notion of, we want to collectively solve this problem, right? But sometimes problems can feel really heavy and people can say, oh, we'll never solve poverty. And so if you reframe it in a different kind of way, you can get to this community aspiration idea. So the next slide that we have gives you some examples of community aspirations. So the right to play, when children play, the world wins. Isn't that lovely? It's kind of like, we know that not all kids have access to affordable recreation, but this actually frames it in a rights kind of perspective, and it actually frames it in, we're all going to win. The Winnipeg Boldness Project is a really cool initiative in an Indigenous neighborhood in Winnipeg. And it's really about how can we be bold and, improve the outcomes for children in the Winnipeg, in the city of Winnipeg in Canada. So that's kind of cool. Arise Alaska is another Indigenous initiative that's looking at educational outcomes for children and youth. And so it can be about, how we frame, how we aspire to something, and how we bring in that language into thinking about our common agenda, so that it's not, I like to say that a common agenda is sometimes a little bit pedestrian, but an aspiration really is a little bit of our stretch goal. So next slide. We learned this a lot from, so the next idea is around shared measurement and strategic learning. And again, this comes from some of the other fields that are out there, particularly around social innovation. And so Tamarack has a really unique perch in the world. We get to look across a variety of different issue areas. And one of the things that we've been particularly focused on recently is bringing in social innovation practices into community change work and really democratizing these practices. And so we have been for a long time following the work of social labs or innovation labs or whatever. And we're thinking about, how do we intentionally bring that work in? And this notion of strategic learning really does come from the world of social innovation. And it should be that, the evaluation that we're doing in our collective impact work, because things are shifting and moving all the time, we're in this kind of dynamic world of change, we should be providing real-time feedback, right? And the measurement should be providing to us as the leaders of the collective impact work kind of this feedback that is saying, okay, so we're seeing this change happen. What does that mean for the work that we're doing? And then how do we adjust the work that we're doing? How do we shift our mutually reinforcing activities in a way that leverages, what the data is telling us and what the measurement is telling us? And I'll tell you a really quick story about this. So it wasn't very long into our work in Hamilton where we saw a decline in the poverty rates by 6%. We were just 3 years into the work, and this was Statistics Canada was saying, oh, in Hamilton, the poverty rate has declined by 6%. And we were thinking, wow, we're doing a great job, 6% in 3 years. Wow, that's great. But when we started to disaggregate the data, our focus was on children and their families. And what really happened was that the poverty rate was decreasing most significantly for seniors. And so we thought, wow, okay, so it's good news, bad news, or maybe just good news with a shift on it. And then we started to look at what happened in our community around seniors. Well, at that time, we have a very diverse community, and there were two different ways that taxes were being transferred to seniors, which essentially helped them move above the poverty line if they access both of these tax transfers. And so that was really interesting because we were seeing seniors move out of poverty because of this system of support about helping them fill in their tax forms. And so we said, wow, that's a really great strategy. What if we brought that strategy into our work with children and families, recognizing that we have a lot of newcomer families, folks for whom, coming to Canada, it's the first time that they filled in their Canadian tax forms, etc. Some people didn't have literacy around tax forms or numeracy, so we could support them in that way. So we took the learning from that kind of decline in the rate of poverty, we transferred it into the population that we were targeting, and we began to see those kinds of results in that population. So strategic learning is a really critical piece because we can see in real time and then adjust our strategies in terms of change in a way that has bigger and deeper impact on the community. So we'll move on to the next slide. This is about mutually reinforcing activities and really considering this notion of high leverage, right? So we could do lots of things in our communities when we're trying to work at and scaling change. We really want to do the work where it's going to have the biggest impact, right? And so if we look at mutually reinforcing activities as that wealth of activities that already exist, then we want to say, okay, of these things, all these programs and services that are already being delivered, where are the leverage points for us, particularly if we're working at policy and systems change? What's that kind of sweet spot of leverage where we have collaboration, independent action, and these evolving systems that will really get us quicker to scale? And how can we be strategic about that? And that's the value of really having a wide and diverse group of people around your table, because you might think one thing is high leverage, but they might see something else in the community that might be even higher leverage, and they might have some resources that they're going to be able to put behind it. So it's continually asking yourselves that kind of question. The next slide, Kathy. So the idea here around this condition of collective impact is really about thinking about, this notion that backbones are one thing, and we know that often we think about backbones as the staffing component to help drive the collective impact work forward. We actually think that the work of the backbone is much bigger. And so we started to frame it as these containers for change, right? And the containers are really about the mobilization, this movement building strategy that we think can be really powerful in collective impact work. And it's really, some of us, we use a lot at Tamarack this notion of a pressure cooker, right? Those of you that cook with pressure cookers know that you're adjusting the heat at all times. And so in collective impact work, there might be times in this container that you're going to, or this pressure cooker, where you're going to turn up the heat because there's real opportunities to move the work forward. And then there might be times where you need to turn down the heat because something has happened and you want to kind of turn the volume down. And so a container is about these kinds of characteristics, right? The facilitation of the participants' inner journey of change. It's the convening capacity that you have. It's the timely nudges that have to be put into place to make the process either sustain itself or build in self-fueling functions, that kind of thing. And so, our thinking, Mark and my thinking about collective impact, is that we think that the framework, the 3 preconditions and the 5 conditions are roughly right. And in fact, have given us this really nice shared language for how we can collectively do this work of community change. Our addition of these ideas behind Collective Impact 3.0 are really, how can we turn the sound up and get to even larger volume, right? How can we get there faster? How can we change our mindsets on how this work evolves and how we think about this work, and really get to deep and durable change? And so I'm going to end by telling you a quick little story about Hamilton, because I've referred to it a couple of times here. When we started the work in Hamilton, the city of Hamilton, a population of about 500,000 people, we had 96,000 people living in poverty, and they're currently now under 70,000 people. So while we haven't gotten to zero, we have made a significant difference in a significant portion of the population's lives. And so that, I think, is testament to some of these concepts of really turning outward and really authentically engaging our community, and also leveraging some high leverage opportunities. So when our provincial government, which is equivalent to state government, decided that they wanted to advance a poverty strategy, we saw that as a high leverage opportunity and really helped to influence some of their work. So, I think these additions, this Collective Impact 3.0 approach, can be very helpful to those of you that are working in this sphere of community change. So I'll turn it back to you, Kathy. There's one more slide, which is just some additional resources. Yeah, we'll just go to the additional resources slide. So these are some additional resources if you want to read. And on the Tamarack website, we have a ton of collective impact resources. So please do come to our website and access any of the resources that we have available to you. So back to you, Kathy. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I do have some other slides here. Maybe we'll go through them really quickly. Just a couple of learning opportunities. So for those of you that want to dive in a little bit deeper, we have an evaluation workshop that is coming up, which we're trying to weave the notion of evaluation and design thinking together. And so how do we design evaluations in a way that they really are used? And how do we design them for systems change? And that's coming up in November. We have another 2 workshops, so if you want to bring those up, one on human-centered design. Again, this is about taking the social innovation practices and weaving them into the work that we're doing. So that's happening in Winnipeg today and in Guelph later in October. And then one around prototyping. So those are some of the upcoming workshops that we have at Tamarack that we're moving forward. So please do look at our resources, and please, I'd love to, I know we have some questions, but I'd love to hear your feedback after Lisa's presentation on Collective Impact 3.0 and what you think about it and any questions you might have about it.
Thanks, Liz. As many of you know, that was the foundation of not only where we started and where this work is going, but it's also helpful to see some real world examples right here in Florida. So with that, I'd love to, Liz gave us some great things to think about. I took tons of notes in terms of how I want to bring some of this work into our work. But Lisa, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about how you all are bringing this work to life in Future Ready Collier. I know you have some specific examples to share, but maybe start a little bit with giving people the 10,000-foot view of what is Future Ready Collier.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you. It's an honor to be here, an honor to work with Liz. I've watched many of taped online workshops with her, so it's just really fun to be involved in this together. So thanks for the opportunity, Kathy, to bring this to Florida. As Kathy mentioned at the beginning, one of the things about Future Ready Collier is this idea of, we start with the end in mind, and this is the class of 2036. We've challenged ourselves over the years to really stay focused on what that end game is and what it looks like when we all work together. And in Collier County, as you'll see in the next slide, and Kathy originally introduced us, we have more than 60 organizations and partners working together toward those common goals, both on the kindergarten readiness end and then what it looks like when we launch them into life after high school. Our Future Ready Collier is part of a regional collaboration that's called Future Makers, the Future Makers Coalition, which is organized for the 5-county area. And in Collier County, we have an LCAN basically that's organized to support those overall regional goals. And we're only able to do that with the support of our sustaining partners who give us the time and the privilege to work together, to be able to really pull these pieces together and share, as Liz said, those opportunities to really build that community capacity around how we work together. So we appreciate their support. We also recently launched, in June, launched our first report to the community. So I encourage you to download that, and it's also part of the attachments on the webinar, because you'll see a lot of the detail around what we've been working on together in that report. I'm just going to stay focused today on some very specific examples to help see how we might learn about what Collective Impact 3.0 looks like in our own communities. So in Collier County, what we decided to do was really do a fact finding and decided that the most logical first places for a community to collaborate around students would be those transitions. So when we launch them to kindergarten and when we launch them into life. So our part of the continuum has been in those areas. And we spent quite a few, almost a year and a half, deciding that we were going to learn, as you'll see in the next slide, about what those children looked like in our youngest residents, and this idea that what Liz is referring to around strategic learning, this idea that if we don't know the scope and scale of what our communities look like, we all have individual programs, there are lots of different entities focusing on things, but until we really know what that looks like, what does that mean? And we were all pretty amazed to come to the place where we learned what the story was, that there are 17,000 kids 0 to 4 in our community, and when those children enter kindergarten, half of them are not ready. And what does that mean as a community to really help those kids walk in the door of school ready is something that we've been really focused on. So this has been a very important kind of data point and strategic learning around that. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see our whole fact-finding process really emerged that we as partners wanted to try to align and focus on certain priorities, and you see those on your screen, but really it's focused on that developmental screening, parent support and outreach, and what it looks like to have quality providers and access for children all across our very large geographic county, and how do we raise that awareness to help them understand the importance around early learning. On the other side of the spectrum, we were really looking at, thanks to an initial relationship that goes way back with the Florida College Access Network in 2012. Collier County was the first county that got our local data around FAFSA completion, degree attainment, and we have been using that learning every year ever since 2012 to really help us focus on what can we learn from this. So for us, when we look at the statistics around degree attainment and that less than 40% of working age adults in our county have a 2-year degree or more, what that told us was that's likely to be our workforce and it's likely to be our parent base, excuse me. And how do we put supports in place to help parents attain and support their children as they're going through this process? That was a very important niche that we thought as partners we could play, and it's become a significant priority, as you'll see in the next slide, for those college and career readiness priorities. So we know about access and FAFSA completion and what that means for communities, understanding that as they get to college, many of them have challenges in their lives that might require some community support, understanding the relevance of career-based learning and internships, and then really helping young children and middle school age children stay on task for high school graduation are those key areas for us. So that's been our focus based on our kind of group learning. And when you look at the next slide, what's really been an outcome has been this idea that, as Liz was saying, this capacity for collaboration takes a lot of different kinds of skills when you work together across different respective missions and staying focused on, you know, the big goal around those 17,000 0 to 4 kids. For us, it started in program learning, where we learned about what all of us did and what the big needs were, and we're mapping gaps and looking at what needs to come next. So we're in that process now as we continue to look ahead. How do we keep aligning those pieces? And if you look at the next slide, I'm going to focus on 2 examples here that I think illustrate not all of 3.0, but some elements of 3.0. And the first is what happened in our community after Hurricane Irma last year. And before I even go there, you know, our hearts go out to our neighbors and friends in northern Florida and the recovery that's going on now. So we definitely understand a lot of what you're going through, and hope that we know that your local communities are coming together to rebuild. We were very fortunate after Irma. You know, it came September 10th, and all of you who know around, you know, FAFSA opens October 1st, which is very important to all of us. We decided, if you look at the next slide, we decided that a previously scheduled meeting was going to take place, even though, as you see, our schools were storm shelters. We had more than 29 of them that opened as storm shelters out of our 52 schools, and they house more than 17,000 people. The leadership and the commitment of our school district to lead in our community and protect our residents was an amazing thing that they did. And what it meant was, after that was over, as community members, we needed to come together, as you'll see in the next slide, just 2 weeks later, to say, you know, how are we really going to get focused on the success of kids and balance the priorities of all these well-being and storm recovery pieces. So we got together on September 27th and retooled, as you'll see in the next slide, retooled our priorities, really focusing on knowing those families with children 0 to 4 would need significant help, as their early learning centers were still closed, and what all those pieces would look like. So the group devised a strategy that they spread out across all of the partners to call all the centers, and very quickly assessed the damage, knew who needed help, and we were primed for then the opportunity when Save the Children came and wanted to know what they might do to support our community after the hurricane, we were able to quickly identify through our Early Learning Coalition a way to invest those dollars and get those centers reopened, which was critical. On the other end, we were looking at FAFSA completion. We sat in our school district office and everyone knew how important it was for the senior class after all of their hard work not to get so behind in a difficult year. So we're pleased. There were lots of different things that we changed. Sometimes these sorts of situations mean that you innovate differently, and when you're already working together before it happens, we believe that it helped us be ready to really be sure that we could do things in a way that made sure that that class of 2018 did not lose ground. And we're happy to say they did not. As you can see, those scholarship and FAFSA completion numbers for last year matched and exceeded the prior year. So we were really excited, and all the support of all the partners toward those goals. And making those adjustments on the fly was critical to do that. The second example I'd like to share is around what we've been talking about around authentic engagement. And we decided all along in our conversations that parents are the common denominator around we wish parents would know about what it meant to delay your 4-year-old physical and what that would mean for your 5-year-old's registration, to help them register on time for kindergarten. We have been often walking that walk around how do we work with families in a way that drives ownership and engagement and leadership within those communities. We're fortunate enough for many years to work with David Moore, who helped to introduce us to not only authentic engagement strategies, but also we brought in the Strengthening Families framework into our community last year and learned all about it and identified a parent cafe model called Be Strong Families out of Illinois. And we all, as 11 partners of our group, decided we were going to get started and got trained in what a parent cafe did. And we are now conducting parent cafes all across Collier County. If you go to the next slide, we've got the 11 organizations that are spearheading it. But we expect by February that we'll have more than 300 parents from all across the county and from all different backgrounds having had this conversation that really is designed to drive parent-to-parent knowledge and parent-to-parent leadership. We're very thrilled. There have been all of the sort of value that parents are excited about. And just to give you a sense, everything from superheroes, success it takes you, being involved in your child's learning, there's a whole host of themes. And partners are working together to volunteer with each other's cafe to really drive that parent piece. So we're really excited by the early results of this. We are committed and think that this is one of the best opportunities we have as a community to provide a framework for families to have that kind of interaction and ownership in the success of their children. So that's just two pieces that we've started in the last couple of years. And we really, a lot of that authentic engagement that Liz talked about, we've been finding in different ways. And really just that ownership that we've been trying to work together. As partners, we all know we're working hard and we do start and stop, but we don't ever really stop. We're really very committed to that end game for our families. With that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Those are great examples. And let me go ahead and advance so that we know we're opening up for questions. If you have a question, please enter it at any time. I've heard some great things throughout the last half hour or so. And one of the things that Liz, you touched on in your slides, and Lisa, I've heard you say before, is this idea that, collective impact really requires a different kind of leadership because it's not that top-down, either one decision maker or a small group of people making a decision for an entire community. Community-wide change just doesn't really work very well that way. So it really requires that inner journey of changing who you are as a leader. And I know, Liz, you specifically referenced helping people through that inner journey of change. A lot of times we think about we're going to go change people out there, but it really starts with their own. I know, Lisa, you've talked about the work has changed you as well. So Liz, can you start a little bit and tell us a little bit about what that means and what that looks like? And then I'll have Lisa chime in with her example.
Yeah, I think for me, it really is about, saying if I'm trying to enter into trying to solve something in our community, I have about this much of the knowledge, right? I have like one sliver of the pie, and everybody else brings expertise that can really add value to whatever issue we're trying to tackle. And it's that 360 idea. We had this guy a number of years ago, John Ott, who has written a number of books, and he talks about this idea of a scallop principle. And if you think about scallops, if you're opening the clam shell of a scallop, they have lots of these little black eyes, right? And so it really is how many eyes do we need, or whose eyes do we need to have on this problem to be able to get a 360 lens on it, but also then get closer and closer to the solution of the issue. And I think, the real challenge that we face is that many of us, and I would say virtually everybody on the call, are paid to be problem solvers, right? That's how we are paid. And that is how we identify our own egos. And to then come into a room and say, okay, so we've got 40 or 50 people in this room and we're all trying to solve the problem. Well, we're never going to get very far. What we have to do is say, okay, this is my understanding of this problem and how it unfolds. This is yours, this is yours, this is yours, etc. And then what's our sense making around that in order to get to a solution that really can impact community? Which means that sometimes we have to leave our egos at the door a little bit, or bring them in the room, but maybe not be fully ego at the table. Say, Kathy, you have some knowledge that I don't have, and Lisa, you have some knowledge that I don't have, and it's this combination of experiences that will get us closer and closer.
Absolutely. It's really, being open to learning enough to leverage that wisdom in the room. Lisa, I know you've talked about how this work has changed you as a leader. Can you share a little bit about not only how you've seen it change you, but how you've seen it change some of the leaders that you collaborate with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most interesting parts of this process is how it provides more clarity for what your own role is and how you fit within a bigger picture. Both you as an individual and your own organization that you represent. As we've gone through the last almost 3 years, I've seen it really evolved to at Champions for Learning. We're getting better and better and better at articulating our own mission inside of this big picture. And I've been seeing that happen in our partner organizations as well, where it's given us a chance to really clarify who does what, how might we see the gaps, who has room to kind of expand or fill a gap, and where do we hand things off when there's duplication. And that's hard. That's really hard to do because we're pretty committed to those structures. And so it's just been a really, really great opportunity for all of us. It's very reflective. It causes you to think, okay, did I just do that because that's the way I'm used to doing it? Or, what are we trying to do together? So it's been really a great opportunity for me personally, professionally, and for our organization to help facilitate those conversations.
Well, and one of the things that I've seen you and in your community do so well is to really, I'm a big strengths-based focused person. So what are the strengths that different players bring to the table? Because as Liz was saying earlier, there's no way any one of us has all the answers. So who does have a strength in that area that we can bring forth and give that partner an opportunity to shine? From Debbie, I'm hearing, I would love to know how you've included families of kids with special needs at all levels, with kindergarten readiness and transition out of high school especially, both in Collier and Canada. So Lisa, why don't we start with you first?
Sure, and I may not be able to answer that fully. Those who have more of that knowledge are not here on the webinar with me. But one of the key things that we saw immediately when we started to uncover the rates of developmental screenings for children 0 to 4, and there's no one way. We don't have a statewide system that captures that information. But as we went through kind of a fact-finding mission with some expert help, we realized that we were underreported. So Collier County was underreported for developmental screenings for the size and demographics of our county. So we've been working through a process of how do we really start increasing the families that at least get screened so that they have the ability to find those resources to support their family. The other part that I'll speak to just this much, because I don't have enough depth of knowledge, but our partners have shared with us that the knowledge and trust that they build helps them then build transitions with each other. So our Friends of Foster Children Forever, for example, along with other partners who are bringing identified children into the public schools. They've been working on better transitions in kind of these at-risk populations.
Great. And Liz, how about you?
So I can talk a little bit about the Hamilton experience. So it was very similar to what you just talked about, Lisa. What they found in the poverty work in Hamilton was that poverty was very localized in certain neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods didn't get the same amount of screening as other neighborhoods got. And so when children entered into the school system in kindergarten, even though they might have had, eyesight issues or speech issues, hearing issues, they weren't screened until well into kindergarten, and then they were further behind. So they were able to negotiate as a community in the low-income neighborhood screening at 3 years old versus at 5 years old. And so those children were supported and families were supported. Ones with sight problems were, had access to glasses and things like that. And others with other developmental delays got more supports in community-based centers. And so they found that as they did that, the outcomes when kids started to enter school, they were able to, do things that were like reading the blackboard and, if there was a developmental delay, they had better supports, and so they had better outcomes. And so the kids in low-income neighborhoods were not further behind, even further behind when they entered into the school system. So that's made a pretty significant difference. There are some other initiatives in Canada. There's an initiative, I'm actually meeting with them tomorrow, called Worktopia, and they're trying to shift the system, the employment system for young people on the autism spectrum, and really looking at how do they work with parents and their families, but also work with the employment system and with service providers and say, okay, so what kinds of supports have to happen within the employment system to be able to effectively employ individuals on the autism spectrum, young people on the autism spectrum, and how do they enter that, and what are the shifts that have to happen, to make them, to help them be employment ready, to help the places of employment be employment welcoming, etc. So it's this kind of cross Canada initiative that's really going to focus on a particular subpopulation, but will have lots of, I think, really rich learnings, and already has some really rich learnings in terms of how to work with employers to make employers more welcoming and more ready for folks with all different kinds of abilities.
That's great news. And, so many of our students are willing and able. They just need a little bit of support to get started. So, first, let me say thank you to Lisa and Liz for joining us today. So much great information. Again, all of the handouts and the slides will go out after our call today. If you are new to FCAN's work and are interested in staying on top of future opportunities for learning, for our dashboards, for our legislative updates, I encourage you to go on our website to floridacollegeaccess.org/subscribe. Our next webinar will be on November 15th from 11 to noon. Thankful for Pell, the past, present, and future of needs-based aid. And with that, I'm going to close this out today. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, ladies.